She bit through her own lip to keep from screaming. The blood was warm and copper, and she swallowed it because she would not give them the sound they were waiting for. Eleanor Marsh had been a school teacher 3 weeks ago. She had owned books, pressed wildflowers between their pages, and known the capital of every state in the Union. She had stood in front of a classroom and watched children's faces change the moment letters turned into words. That small electric transformation she lived for. Now a man she had never met was grabbing her jaw with both hands and turning her face toward a crowd of strangers who were bidding on her like she was a horse they planned to work half to death. Lot number 7. She hadn't known when she stepped off the stagecoach in Copper Bend, Wyoming territory, that a man at the back of that crowd was about to throw away every dollar he'd spent 7 years earning for a woman he had never spoken a single word to. Stay with this story to the very end. Subscribe to our channel and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far Eleanor's story travels. The gavel cracked like a rifle shot, and Eleanor's whole body flinched. The rope around her wrists pulled tighter. She bit down again on her bleeding lip and drove the sound back down her throat. She would not give them that. Not this crowd, not this town, not one single tear. The auctioneer had the kind of voice that belonged on a man who'd spent his life selling things he should have been ashamed of, rusty practiced, empty of anything resembling conscience. He grabbed her shoulder and shoved her forward to the very edge of the platform, close enough that the crowd could see her clearly, close enough that the July sun hammered down on her bare head and made the world tilt slightly. 28 years old, he called out. Reads and writes, good teeth, strong back. Who starts me at 300, good teeth, like a horse? Eleanor locked her knees and fixed her gaze on the mountains beyond the rooftops of Copper Bend. They rose in the distance, ancient, enormous, wholly indifferent to the small cruelty being performed in this dusty square. They had been standing when this territory was nothing but wind and grass, and they would still be standing long after every man on this platform was forgotten. Somehow that helped. Knowing something in the world existed that couldn't be bought or bid upon. 300, someone called. 350. 4. Each number stripped something from her she could not name. She was Eleanor Marsh, daughter of Thomas Marsh, professor of Latin at Haverford College, who had read poetry aloud after supper and told her every single day of her childhood that education was the one thing no person on earth could ever take from you. He had been wrong about that. 3 weeks in Copper Bend had taught her they could take anything, everything. The auctioneer leaned close. His breath smelled of tobacco and something sweet and rotten underneath. Smile pretty, he murmured, and maybe you'll fetch enough for a decent supper tonight, sweetheart. Eleanor turned just enough to look at him. Take your hand off me. His fingers dug into her shoulder hard enough to bruise. Listen here, girl. You cause trouble on my platform, I hand you to the Cutter brothers for free. They got a place up in the hills. Women go up there. He paused. Let the silence do its work. They don't come back down. We clear. Eleanor said nothing. She did not drop her eyes. 500. The voice cut through the bidding, the way a blade cuts through paper, clean, decisive without effort. The crowd shifted necks, craning. Eleanor already knew who it was before she found him. Everyone in Copper Bend knew Harlan Voss the same way everyone knows a rattlesnake in their barn. You learned his face on your first day because your survival depended on recognizing it. He stepped forward from the near edge of the crowd, silver-haired, impeccably dressed in a charcoal coat, despite the July heat, with the comfortable posture of a man who had never once in his life walked into a room he didn't already own. Harlan Voss owned the biggest ranch in the territory. He owned half the storefronts on Copper Bend's main street. He owned the telegraph operator, the land office clerk, and Judge Aldous Merritt, who rode through the territory twice a year and called it justice. He had purchased the schoolhouse where Eleanor was supposed to teach and converted it to a grain warehouse 2 days before she arrived. When she'd gone to the sheriff to complain, he'd smiled at her the way you smile at a child who doesn't yet understand how the world works. When she tried to leave town the first time, Voss's men brought her back. When she tried the second time, they stopped being gentle about it. 3 weeks. That was all it had taken. 3 weeks to go from a woman with a future to a woman with a price. Voss smiled at the crowd. 500 for the teacher, he said as if he were purchasing a lamp. Fitting, isn't it? I already own the schoolhouse. Laughter. Some men looked at their boots. Most didn't bother. 500 going once. 550, a gap-toothed miner called from somewhere in the middle of the crowd. 600. Voss didn't even glance at the man. 650. 7. One word, bored, like ordering coffee. The miner went quiet. Everyone went quiet. That was how Copper Ben worked. Voss bid. Everyone else folded. End of story. It had always been the end of every story in this town. Eleanor's hands had gone numb. The rope was too tight. She'd told them that when they'd bound her, and the man with the rope had smiled and made it tighter. She could feel her pulse throbbing in her fingertips now, that dull, insistent ache that told her blood was being refused where it needed to go. They'd taken her bonnet. They'd taken her shoes too, and the rough planks of the auction platform were full of splinters that bit into the soles of her bare feet every time she shifted her weight. She thought about her father. What would Thomas Marsh say if he could see his daughters standing here, the man who'd pressed a copy of Shakespeare into her hands at 7 years old, who'd taught her to argue a point until it was bulletproof, who'd told her she was smarter than half the professors at his university and meant every word of it. Education is the one thing nobody can take from you, Elle. Remember that. She remembered. She also remembered that it hadn't stopped any of this. 800, Voss said. He looked around the crowd with the unhurried patience of a man who'd already won. Anybody else want to waste my morning? Silence. The auctioneer raised his gavel. 800 going 1,000. 2 words, spoken quietly, not shouted, barely raised above the murmur of the crowd, but they landed like a stone dropped into still water, and every head turned at once. Eleanor's eyes found him before she understood why they had. He was leaning against the hitching post at the far edge of the square. She hadn't noticed him before. He was the kind of man you didn't notice until he decided you would all stillness and shadow blended into the background, the way something wild blends in when it knows how to wait. Then he straightened up, and the waiting was over. He was tall in the way that some men simply are not announced, not performed, just present. Broad across the shoulders, wearing a plain shirt, gone soft from too many washings, leather vest boots, so worn the stitching showed at the heel. A gun belt that hung easy on his hips, the revolver riding low in the way that meant it was part of him and not decoration. He stepped forward, and the crowd divided for him the way crowds do for men they sense without being able to name. Voss turned slowly. Rourke. One word, loaded with years. Voss. The man stopped 10 feet from the platform and tipped his hat back. Eleanor saw his face fully for the first time, hard jaw, several days of dark stubble, eyes the gray-green color of a mountain creek in early spring. The kind of eyes that had looked at too many hard things and long ago stopped flinching. A thin white scar cut through his left eyebrow. He wasn't looking at Voss. He was looking at Eleanor. Not at her bare feet, or her torn dress, or the blood drying on her mouth. At her face, at her eyes. The way a person looks at another person when they actually see them standing there. Something cracked open in Eleanor's chest. She didn't have a name for what it was. Walk away, Voss said. A command dressed as advice. 1,000, the man Rourke repeated without taking his eyes off Eleanor. His voice was level, unhurried. That's what I said. 1,200, Voss snapped. First time Eleanor had heard an edge in his voice. 1,500. The crowd pulled in a collective breath. $1,500. A year's wages for most men in this territory. A sum that represented years of riding fence in all weather, of sleeping on frozen ground, of selling calves at poor prices, and eating what was left. You don't have that kind of money, Voss said. The mask was slipping. Now Eleanor could see the twitch at the corner of his mouth, the new stiffness in his neck. That dirt patch you're sitting on barely feeds your horses. Didn't ask your opinion on my finances, Harlan. Rourke's voice stayed easy. 2,000. Dead silence. Not whispers, not murmurs. Silence so complete Eleanor could hear flies buzzing in the heat 20 feet away. Then 3,000. Voss said it slowly, like a man laying down a card he expected to end the game. He looked around the crowd. His expression said, "This is over. Go home. There's nothing left to see." Rourke reached into his vest and drew out a leather pouch. He didn't open it or weigh it or hesitate. He just held it out in front of him. Open hand steady, the way you hold something precious when you have made your peace with losing it. But Eleanor could see his knuckles. White, pressed tight around the leather like a man gripping the edge of a cliff he was about to let go of. It wasn't nothing. She understood that instantly. It was everything. 3,000, Voss repeated, slowly scanning the crowd. Going once, $3,001, Rourke said. The auctioneer froze. Someone in the crowd made a sound that was almost a laugh and immediately thought better of it. Voss's jaw went rigid. Something moved behind his eyes, calculation, then rage, then something cold and patient and deeply wrong. He looked at Eleanor with that cold thing in his face, and Eleanor looked back and did not blink. Then Voss laughed. Short, ugly. He adjusted his vest, tugged his cuff straight, and turned. Have her, he said, as if he were declining a dish he hadn't wanted anyway. You just made the most expensive mistake of your life, Rourke. Wouldn't be the first. Rourke stepped forward toward the platform without watching Voss go. Wouldn't even crack the top 10. The threat hung behind Voss in the air like smoke as he walked. His boots made sharp sounds on the packed dirt. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The gavel came down. Sold. $3,001 to Caleb Rourke. The auctioneer held the rope attached to Eleanor's wrists out toward Rourke with a dead-eyed smile spreading across his face. All yours. Word of advice, keep her bound till she learns her place. These educated ones take longer to knife. Rourke's voice cut across the man's sentence like it wasn't there. Give me a knife or I'll use my own. Someone tossed one up from the crowd. Rourke caught it without looking. He turned to Eleanor, and Eleanor flinched, her body doing it before her mind could prevent it. 3 weeks of training, 3 weeks of hands that grabbed and voices that threatened, and every reflex retrained towards self-preservation. He stopped. 3 feet away, knife in his hand, crowd, watching July sun hammering down. I'm going to cut these ropes, he said. Quiet, just for her. That's all, you tell me when. Eleanor looked at the knife. She looked at his eyes, that gray-green, the steady creek water calm of them. She looked for the thing that men like the auctioneer had in their eyes, the thing she'd learned to identify in 3 weeks. It wasn't there. Now, she said, he cut. The ropes fell. Eleanor gasped, not from relief, but from pain, from the brutal rush of blood returning to her crushed hands. She looked down at her wrists, raw, oozing, rope burns circling both arms like bracelets made of damage. Rourke looked at them too. His jaw clenched so hard the scar through his eyebrow went white. He turned to the auctioneer. Who tied her like this? Standard procedure. I asked who. The auctioneer's smile disappeared. Now look here, Rourke. We'll finish this conversation next time I'm in town. Rourke's voice had gone to something quiet and very still. You think about that between now and then. He shrugged off his leather vest and laid it across Eleanor's shoulders. It smelled like saddle leather and sage, and the kind of honest sweat that comes from real work. The weight of it steadied her in a way she hadn't expected and couldn't fully explain. Can you walk? He asked. I can walk. Then let's go. Stay close. They stepped off the platform together. The crowd parted. Eleanor kept her chin level and her eyes forward and refused to look at any of them. The men who'd bid on her, the women who'd watched from doorways and done nothing, the sheriff standing on the boardwalk with his arms folded and his badge catching the sun like it deserved to. One face found hers anyway. An older woman near the back of the crowd, 60 perhaps, with iron gray hair pinned under a plain bonnet and a flour-dusted apron still tied around her waist. Bess Garner, the only person in this whole town who'd shown Eleanor a scrap of human decency in 3 weeks, a piece of bread shoved through the boarding house window, a whispered, I'm sorry, child, in the dark. Bess pressed one hand against her chest. Eleanor gave her the smallest nod she could manage. Then they were past the crowd around the corner of the Mercantile, out of sight. Eleanor's legs gave out. She didn't fall. Rourke's hand was at her elbow before she reached the ground, not grabbing, not pulling, just there. The way a man sets a post into the earth when he wants it to stay. Almost there, he said. 30 more feet. She made 30 feet. His wagon sat in the shade of the alley, 2 bay horses flicking their ears at the flies. He helped her up to the seat, hands steady, grip careful, no more pressure than necessary, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. The horses moved. Copper Bend began to shrink behind them. The auction platform, the crowd, the auctioneer's platform, Voss's office window, where Eleanor felt in her bones the man standing and watching them leave. Where are we going? She asked. My place. 4 hours northwest. He kept his eyes on the trail. Got a spare cabin you can use. One room small clean. Door locks from the inside. Keys yours. Eleanor turned that sentence over. Door locks from the inside. Keys yours. What do you want from me? She asked. Flat, direct, because 3 weeks had taught her that men who did things for women always wanted something. Nothing. Don't say nothing. Nobody spends $3,000 for nothing. Rourke was quiet for a moment. A muscle moved in his jaw. Then, all right, not nothing. I want Harlan Voss to know he can't have every damn thing in the world just because he decides he wants it. That's what I bought today. Not you. I bought his face when I outbid him. Eleanor stared at him. So I'm a weapon, something you pointed at Voss. No, ma'am. He glanced at her sideways. You're a free woman who can get off this wagon anytime she wants. Say the word, I'll siege the horses. He meant it. She could see that he meant it, and it made her angry. Angry that she believed him, angry that she wanted to believe him, angry that 3 weeks of being handled like an object had turned the ability to trust into something that felt dangerously close to weakness. Keep driving, she said. They rode in silence. The land opened wide around them, rolling hills of brown grass going gold in the heat, cottonwoods bunched along dry creek beds, hawks turning slow circles overhead. The July sun pressed down and the wagon raised a veil of dust that covered their tracks as they went. After a long while, Eleanor spoke. I wasn't always lot number 7. Rourke said nothing, just listened. I was a teacher. In Philadelphia. I was good at it. The children liked me. The parents respected me. I had my own classroom. She pressed her cracked lips together. I was engaged, too, to a man named Edmund Hale. Educated, charming, came from a fine family. Everyone said I was lucky. She paused. I found him in bed with my closest friend 6 months ago. Rourke's hands tightened on the reins, barely visible, but she noticed. So I decided to start over. I answered an advertisement for a teaching position in Copper Bend, Wyoming territory. The town council sent a letter, signed, sealed, official. I sold my books, my furniture, my mother's china, got on a stage and rode 1,500 miles. Her voice went thin and brittle. Got there and found the schoolhouse was a grain warehouse. The teaching position didn't exist, and the man who owned the whole town had decided I wasn't leaving. Voss. When I went to the sheriff, he smiled at me. When I went to Voss himself, he offered me a room at the boarding house. That first night, my drink was drugged. I woke in a locked room, my money, my papers, everything I owned gone. She pulled back her sleeve. A bruise purple, black, and ugly wrapped around her upper arm where fingers had gripped hard enough to leave individual marks. I tried to escape twice. The second time they were less patient. Rourke saw it. His knuckles went white on the reins. I'm not telling you this for pity, Eleanor said sharply. I'm telling you so you know exactly what kind of man you just made an enemy of. I already know what kind of man he is. Then you know he'll come for you. Rourke was quiet for a long beat. Then, Miss Marsh, I've been worried about Harlan Voss for 3 years. Today's the first day I did something about it, instead of just sitting with the worry. A pause. Feels better if I'm honest. Something in his voice snagged her attention. 3 years. What happened 3 years ago? The silence stretched, the wagon creaked, the horses plodded on. My wife died, Rourke said. Adeline. She was having our baby. Things went wrong. I rode to Voss. He was the only man close enough with the means to send for a doctor from Cheyenne. His voice stayed level, but Eleanor could hear the effort behind each word, the weight of them. He said he'd send for one if I signed over my water rights. Eleanor's hand moved to her throat. I signed. The paper hit his desk, and he poured himself a drink and told me he'd send a rider at first light. Rourke's jaw worked. Adeline needed help then. Not at first light. I got on my knees in his office and I begged him. Told him there wasn't time to wait. Eleanor couldn't breathe. He said first light was the best he could do. Told me to go home and pray. Rourke stared at the road ahead, at something far beyond it. Adeline died at midnight, the baby an hour after. The rider Voss promised never came. Not at first light, not ever. Oh, God. He sent the sheriff with the water rights paperwork the day I buried her. Had the papers delivered right there at the grave. Rourke exhaled long, slow, like a man releasing pressure from somewhere very deep. So no, Miss Marsh, I'm not doing this out of charity. And I'm not doing it because I'm some kind of hero. I'm doing it because that man took everything from me and smiled while he did it. And when I saw him bidding on you today, he stopped. I couldn't stand there again. Not a one more time. Not and live with myself. The wagon rolled on. The mountains watched. The silence between them had changed, no longer empty, but full-weighted with the kind of understanding that doesn't need words to stand. Eleanor pulled his vest tighter around her shoulders. I came west to teach, she said quietly, not to be rescued. Didn't rescue you, just bought you some time. She looked at him. I'm going to open a school. He glanced at her first time she'd seen anything close to surprise on his face. In Copper Bend. Somewhere, anywhere. These children out here deserve a teacher, and I'm a damn good teacher. The corner of Rourke's mouth moved, almost a smile. Almost. I believe that, he said. They reached the ranch as the sun bled out against the mountains in long red streaks. Small place log house, stone chimney, weathered barn. 3 horses in the corral lifted their heads at the sound of the wagon. A black dog came running from somewhere behind the house, gave one short bark, then fell into step beside the wheels as if she'd been waiting all afternoon for exactly this. That's Reva, Rourke said. A man appeared in the barn doorway. Dark hair worn in a long braid, copper skin, calm eyes that cataloged everything around him and gave nothing away. He looked at Eleanor, looked at the cloth around her wrists, looked at Rourke and said nothing. Jonas, Rourke said. This is Eleanor Marsh. She'll be staying in the spare cabin. Jonas Birdsong looked at Eleanor for a moment longer. Then I'll make up the bed. Nothing else. No questions. Just that. Rourke showed her the cabin. 1 room. Small clean. A rope bed with a blanket folded at the foot. A pine table. A single chair. A small iron stove. He put the key on the table. Locks from the inside, he said. Always has. Always will. He turned to leave. Mr. Rourke. He stopped in the doorway, the dying light behind him. You spent everything you had today. I see, Eleanor said. Every dollar. I saw your hand when you held that pouch. You were shaking. He was quiet for a moment. I was, he admitted. Why Bugatti? Because it would breathing, and he paused. And because I'd do it again. He walked out into the last of the day. Eleanor stood alone in her cabin with her key and her lock and her door. She turned the key, heard the bolt slide home. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her fist against her eyes and cried. Not the helpless, humiliated tears of the auction block, but something deeper and fiercer and almost savage. The tears of a woman who'd been buried alive and had just clawed her first handful of dirt free. She was not safe. She knew that clearly. Voss was still out there. The territory was still lawless. She was still broke and alone, and 4 hours from anywhere. But she had a locked door and a key, and a man who'd trembled as he handed over everything he owned. And she was still Eleanor Marsh. They hadn't taken that. Not yet. Not ever. 4 hours south in the biggest house on Copper Bend's main street, a lamp burned behind closed curtains. Harlan Voss sat at his desk with a glass of whiskey sweating in his hand. He opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a map. Rourke's ranch was marked with a small red circle. Voss picked up his pen, dipped it, drew a larger circle around the first. Then he rang the bell on his desk. A big man appeared in the doorway, patient, silent, waiting. Find the Cutter brothers, Voss said. Tell them I have a job. He finished his whiskey and set the glass down with a precise, quiet click. Nobody takes what's mine. Eleanor woke before the sun, with her fists clenched around the bedsheet. For 3 full seconds, she didn't know where she was, and her body reacted to that not knowing the way it had learned to in the boarding house, with a sharp coiling of every muscle breath, held listening for footsteps on the other side of a locked door. Then her fingers found the key on the bedside table, right where she'd left it. The panic drained out of her the way water drains through a crack, steadily, completely, until there was nothing left but the quiet of the cabin and the gray light seeping under the door. She sat up. Her wrists throbbed. The rope burns had scabbed over during the night, and the dried blood pulled at her skin when she flexed her fingers. She looked at the marks in the half-dark and made herself a promise the way her father had taught her to make promises out loud under breath, heard only by herself and the walls around her. Never again. Not ropes, not locked rooms she hadn't chosen. Never again. She was dressed and outside before the sun cleared the ridge. Caleb Ruark was already at the corral pouring grain into the feed trough. He looked up when he heard her boots on the packed dirt, and something crossed his face. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration, as if he'd made a quiet prediction about what she would do and had already begun adjusting his morning around it. "You're up early," he said. "I don't sleep much anymore." He nodded, the kind of nod that meant I know exactly what that means without requiring it to be spelled out. "Coffee's on the stove inside," he said. "Help yourself." Eleanor didn't go to the main house. She leaned against the corral fence and watched him work. "What needs doing today?" He set the grain bucket down slowly. "Miss Marsh." "Eleanor." "Eleanor." He said the name like he was testing its weight. "You don't have to work. I told you last night. And I'm telling you now that I can't sit in that cabin staring at the walls. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever." Her voice came out harder than she intended. She drew it back. "I need to be useful, please." He studied her, those gray-green eyes seeing more than she was offering. "Then can you keep books?" "I taught arithmetic to children for 6 years. I can keep books." "Jonas and I have been running this place from memory. Cattle count supply orders, breeding records, it's all up here." He tapped his temple. "Gets complicated when you're trying to remember whether you bred the red heifer in March or April. You need a ledger system." "I need someone who knows what a ledger system looks like." Something loosened in Eleanor's chest, not gratitude. She was finished with gratitude, which always carried the implication that she owed something in return. This was something else. Recognition. He wasn't offering her charity. He was admitting he needed help. There was a difference, and it mattered more than she could easily explain. "Show me what you've got," she said. What he had was a disaster. Inside the main house, Rourke opened a drawer in the kitchen table and produced a stack of papers so thoroughly disorganized that Eleanor's teeth nearly ached at the sight of them. Receipts from the trading post, crammed in with cattle tallies scratched on the backs of envelopes. A bill of sale for 2 horses tucked inside a letter from someone named James in Missouri. Feed costs recorded on a strip of bark, actual bark peeled from a tree. Tax notices buried under a horse blanket in the corner. "This is everything," he said. Eleanor spread the papers across the table. "How do you know if you're making money or losing it?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "I eat, horses eat. Figured that meant things were all right." Eleanor looked at him. He looked at the floor. Reva the dog came in through the open door and settled under the table with a long sigh, as if she too had been waiting for someone to make sense of this. "This is going to take a while," Eleanor said. Don't appreciate it yet. I haven't found what I'm looking at." She spent the morning sorting. Rourke and Jonas rode out to check the herd, and Eleanor sat alone at that kitchen table with the summer heat building around her and the flies moving lazily against the window glass, turning chaos into order. One crumpled receipt at a time. In Philadelphia, she'd reorganized the school's entire financial records her first year, and the headmaster had called her indispensable. Then Edmund Hale's family had pressured the school board, and indispensable had turned to dismissed faster than she'd thought possible. She shoved that memory aside and kept working. By midday, she had 3 sorted stacks, a list of questions written in hand, so precise it looked typeset, and a figure she hadn't wanted to arrive at. When Rourke came through the door, she said without preamble, "You're losing money." He stopped with one boot on the threshold. "You're paying 12% more for feed than any rancher in this territory should." Eleanor continued, "Because you're buying in small quantities from the trading post instead of ordering in bulk from Cheyenne. Your cattle count doesn't match your last sale receipt. You either lost 4 head to the elements or someone counted wrong. And this," she held up a folded document, "this is a tax assessment from the territorial office. It's 6 months overdue." Rourke came inside and hung his hat on the peg by the door. He did this slowly, like a man spending time he needed to think. "The tax matter," he said. "I know about that. You know you owe the territory $47, and if you don't pay by September, they can legally seize the land." Jonas came in behind him and let out a low whistle. "I had the money set aside," Rourke said. The understanding hit Eleanor so hard, she had to grip the table edge. You spent it, she said. Yesterday, on me. Rourke didn't answer. That $3,000. It wasn't savings for expansion, was it? It was everything: taxes, operating costs, the whole reserve. I'll figure it out. You'll figure it out. She stared at him. You have $47 in outstanding taxes, no cash reserves, 60 head of cattle to feed through the rest of a Wyoming summer, and you'll figure it out. I always do. Eleanor wanted to grab him by the collar of his worn shirt and shake sense into him. Instead, she sat back down, picked up her pen, and began writing. What are you doing? Rourke asked. Figuring it out, since apparently nobody else around here intends to. Jonas looked at Rourke. The corner of his mouth moved. Rourke gave him a look that said, don't. Jonas went back outside. Eleanor was fairly certain she heard him laughing from the yard. She worked through the afternoon. Rourke tried twice to suggest she rest. The first time she ignored him. The second time she looked up and said with the measured clarity she'd once used on unruly 8-year-olds, Mr. Rourke, I was locked in a room for 3 weeks with nothing to do but count the cracks in the ceiling. If you take this work away from me, I will never forgive you. He brought her coffee and stopped suggesting. By supper, she had a plan. She presented it over beans and cornbread, all three of them at the table she'd cleared of papers and reorganized into neat stacks. You have 62 head, she said. Current market price in Cheyenne is $28 per head for good stock. If you sell 10 early before the fall, dries push prices down, you clear $280. That covers the territorial tax, buys bulk winter feed, and leaves a small operating reserve. Rourke chewed and thought. Selling early means I lose those calves next spring. Selling early means you keep the ranch. Next spring doesn't matter if you lose the land in September. Jonas set his fork down. She's right, Caleb. Rourke looked at Jonas, looked at Eleanor. Something shifted behind his eyes, a slow, grudging rearrangement, the way a man who's been looking at a map one way suddenly understands he's been holding it upside down. All right, he said. We sell 10 head. Good. I'll need to go to the trading post to send the sale notice to Cheyenne. I'll take you tomorrow. I can ride. Into unfamiliar territory 10 miles from a man who tried to buy you 48 hours ago. His voice was flat. I'll take you tomorrow. Eleanor opened her mouth, closed it. He had a point. She hated that he had a point. They rode to the Holt trading post the next morning, Rourke and Eleanor on the wagon bench together, Jonas left behind to watch the ranch. The July heat was the kind that made the air shimmer and turned the dirt road into a white ribbon of dust. Eleanor had fashioned a bonnet from fabric she'd found in the cabin, and her wrists were wrapped in clean cloth torn from a shirt Rourke had left folded outside her door without comment. She looked, she knew, like something halfway between a frontier woman and a fugitive. She didn't care. Agnes Holt came out of the trading post before they'd fully stopped the horses. She was a compact, energetic woman with arms that suggested she'd done real physical work all her life and eyes that took in everything and discarded nothing. She put both hands on her hips. Caleb Rourke. She shook her head. Word travels fast in this territory. Is it true $3,000? Morning, Agnes? Don't you morning, Agnes, me. $3,000. She looked at Eleanor and her expression changed, softened, but not into sympathy, into something fiercer than that. You must be the young woman. Eleanor Marsh. Agnes Holt. Get inside, both of you. I've got things to say, and I'd rather say them out of the sun before I melt. Inside, Agnes poured them cold water and shut the door. Her husband Ned looked up from his inventory ledger, nodded at Rourke with the nod of a man acknowledging a complicated situation, and went back to his work. He was the kind of husband who knew when his wife was handling things. Voss has been talking, Agnes said, setting the water glasses down hard enough to slosh. Telling anyone who'll listen that Caleb stole his property. His property, Eleanor said. Each word flat and cold. I know it. Agnes's lips pressed tight. He's also had Sheriff Lyle drawing up some kind of complaint. Says the auction wasn't legal, that the sale should be voided. She looked at Eleanor. Can he actually do that? The auction wasn't legal to begin with, Rourke said. Selling human beings. Since when has Voss cared about legal? Agnes cut in. He's also been asking around about your taxes, Caleb. Knows they're overdue, knows the territorial office can foreclose. Rourke and Eleanor looked at each other. How does he know about my taxes? Rourke asked. Agnes leaned forward. Honey, that man knows what you had for breakfast. He's got eyes on every piece of information that moves in this valley. She lowered her voice. There's more. He hired the Cutter brothers. The name landed like a dropped anvil. Rourke went perfectly still. Jonas had mentioned the Cutters once during the long ride from town, the day before three brothers who operated in the territory's lawless margins, doing work that even men without scruples would turn down. Horse thieves claimed jumpers, the kind of men territorial law couldn't touch because territorial law was too afraid to try. Ned saw them riding out to Voss's place, Agnes said, yesterday right after the auction. She looked at Eleanor with an apology in her face. I don't mean to frighten you. Tell me anyway, Eleanor said. Agnes blinked, then nodded as if Eleanor had just passed some kind of test. Three brothers, Rand, Lyle, and Dutch. Rand's the smart one, which is the dangerous part. Lyle's mean for the pleasure of it. Dutch is large and does what his brothers tell him. She folded her hands on the table. Last spring, they burned out a homesteader family north of Miller's Creek. Husband, wife, 2 children. Sheriff called it an accident. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her water glass. What does Voss want them to do? Nobody knows yet, but it won't be gentle. Rourke stood, his chair scraped. Agnes, I need to get a sale notice to Cheyenne. Does Ned still handle the telegraph messages? Ned handles everything, Agnes said. Then she caught Eleanor's arm as Rourke walked toward the counter. Listen to me, she said low and quick. Caleb Rourke is the best man in this territory. He's also the stubbornest. He'll try to handle whatever's coming alone. Don't let him. Eleanor looked at her steadily. I wasn't planning to. Agnes studied her face. Whatever she found there made her smile hard, satisfied, certain. Good, she said. You'll do. While Rourke arranged the cattle notice with Ned, Eleanor drifted toward the back of the trading post, where a wooden crate sat wedged between a barrel of flour and a broken rocking chair. Her fingers trailed over the spines inside it, Primer's readers, a battered McGuffey's and arithmetic textbook with a cracked binding. Agnes, she called, where did these come from? Agnes came over. Those were supposed to go to the schoolhouse. Ordered them 6 months ago when the town council was still talking about hiring a teacher. Then Voss bought the building and she shrugged. Nobody wanted them. Eleanor pulled out the McGuffey's reader and opened it. The pages smelled like ink and everything that ink represented. How much for all of them? Take them. Lord knows they're not doing any good sitting in that crate. Eleanor carried the box to the wagon herself. Rourke watched her load it without comment. When they were back on the bench and moving, he glanced at the crate beside her feet. Starting a library, he asked. Starting a school. He looked at her sideways. Where? I don't know yet. But the children I saw in Copper Bend, the ones standing in the street with nothing to do and nowhere to be, they deserve better than what Voss has left them. And I am tired, she said with a quiet fury that surprised even her, of men like him deciding what other people deserve. Rourke was silent for a long stretch of road. They were a mile from the ranch when he spoke. There's an old line shack on the north end of my property. Roof solid, hasn't been used in years. Could hold maybe 15, 20 people inside. Eleanor turned to look at him. You'd let me use it. It's sitting empty. You want to put books in it, that's your business. He kept his eyes on the trail. Something in the set of his jaw said he was working very hard to appear unconcerned. The feeling that bloomed in Eleanor's chest was not gratitude. It was something older and more necessary. Purpose. They were 2 miles from the ranch when Rourke pulled the horses up short. Eleanor saw it a half-second later. Smoke, rising from the direction of the ranch in a thin gray column that didn't belong to any time of day, too small for a cooking fire, too deliberate for an accident. Stay here, Rourke said. His hand was already reaching for the rifle. No. Eleanor, I'm not sitting on this wagon waiting to find out. She met his eyes. Drive. His jaw worked. Then he snapped the reins and the horses surged. They came around the last bend and Eleanor's breath left her body. The corral fence was down, not fallen, torn down. The rails scattered like kindling thrown by a careless hand, the posts wrenched from the earth with a deliberateness that was meant to be read clearly. The horses that had been inside were gone. The smoke was coming from behind the barn, Jonas was there with a bucket throwing water against the back wall where the hay was stored. He'd caught it early. The wall was scorched but standing. Rourke was off the wagon before it stopped. Jonas, 20 minutes ago. Jonas tossed another bucket. 3 riders came from the north ridge, tore the fence, spooked the horses, set the fire, and were back over the ridge before I could get a shot off. He paused. Didn't see faces. Eleanor jumped down and grabbed the second bucket. She and Jonas worked the fire while Rourke moved through the property with systematic efficiency. Barn cabin house. When he came back to where they stood by the scorched wall, his face had settled into an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not rage, not fear. Something colder. The face of a man doing arithmetic in his head and not liking the answer. They didn't touch anything else, he said. Just the fence, the horses, and the barn wall. It wasn't an attack, Eleanor said. It was a message. He looked at her. We can reach you whenever we choose. She set down her empty bucket. Voss is telling you what's coming before he sends it. That's what men like him do. They want you to be afraid before they arrive. They want the fear to do the work for them. Rourke said nothing. He was watching her. Are you afraid? She asked. Not of Voss. Then we don't wait for him to define the terms. Eleanor's voice was steady. We sell the 10 head, pay the taxes, take away his legal angle. We rebuild the fence stronger. And I write to every newspaper in the territory about what happened to me in Copper Bend with my name and his name and every detail I can document. Jonas looked at Rourke. She's tougher than you. Shut up, Jonas. Just saying. Rourke turned back to Eleanor. The question in his eyes was real and careful. You'd put your name on it in a newspaper. I'd put my name on the truth. She didn't look away. People will talk. A woman admitting she was bound sold, treated like livestock. Let them talk, she continued before he could respond. Let them read it over their breakfast coffee and choke on it. Because what happened to me is happening to other women right now today, somewhere in this territory, and nobody is saying anything because everyone's too ashamed to be the one who says it first. She paused. Silence is Voss's most powerful tool. I intend to take it from him. The scorched wood popped and crackled as it cooled behind them. Rourke looked at her for a long, still moment. Then he held out his hand, not to shake, not to comfort, to seal something. A pact between two people who had each been broken by the same man. Eleanor took his hand. His grip was firm and warm and didn't flinch. Partners, she said. Partners, he said. Jonas picked up the empty bucket. I'll go find the horses, he said, and walked away toward the ridge with an expression that managed to be both perfectly neutral and deeply amused. That evening, Eleanor sat at Rourke's kitchen table. It had become her workspace without either of them remarking on it, and wrote by lamplight until her hand cramped and her eyes blurred. She wrote about the drugged drink in the locked room. She wrote about the auction and the ropes and her bare feet on the splinter-rough platform. She wrote about Voss. She used his full name every time. When she finished, she folded the letter, sealed it, and sat in the dark with her hand flat against the paper. This was her weapon. Not a rifle, not a fist. Words. She'd come west to teach people how to use them. Virgil Harlan Voss was about to find out what a school teacher could do with 26 letters and the truth. The letter went out 3 days later with the Trading Post supply wagon, 2 copies, one addressed to the Cheyenne Leader, one to the Laramie Sentinel. Both signed in full Eleanor Adeline Marsh. Both dated. Both including the auctioneer's name, Voss's name, the sheriff's name, the date of the auction, and every detail Eleanor could document from memory with the precision of a woman who had been trained since childhood to observe accurately and record completely. Agnes Holt read both copies before they were sealed. She sat in her back room with the pages in her hands and her mouth pressed so tight it went white. You know what this is going to do, she said. They'll come after us harder, Eleanor replied. They're already coming. Agnes folded the letters with great care and tucked them into the supply pouch herself. She looked at Eleanor the way you look at something rare and uncertain. You're either the bravest woman I've ever met, she said, or the craziest. Probably both. Eleanor picked up her hat from the counter. Those aren't mutually exclusive. By the end of the first week after the letters, the ranch had settled into something that resembled routine, which meant in Wyoming territory in the summer of 1878 that nothing had burned down and no one had been shot. The cattle sale notice reached Cheyenne, and a buyer named Hargrove sent back word that he'd arrive within 2 weeks to inspect the herd. Eleanor calculated the numbers 4 different ways and got the same answer every time: 10 head at $28. Cleared the tax debt and bought winter feed with enough left over to breathe. Barely. But barely was a word she had learned to respect. She and Rourke had rebuilt the corral fence, she and Jonas mostly, while Rourke repaired the barn wall, but she'd insisted on working beside them until Jonas handed her a post-hole digger with the gravity of a man handing over a sacred object, and she dug until her shoulders screamed. The new post went in deeper than the old ones. Rourke didn't comment on that, but she'd seen him test one with both hands and nod to himself. She'd also organized every document in the house into a ledger system that tracked income, expenses, and cattle movements by date and category. She'd drawn a map of the property on the back of a broadsheet, sight lines from the house, from the barn, from the north ridge, and marked in red ink every blind spot she could identify. Rourke found her doing this one evening and stood in the doorway watching for a long moment before he said anything. "You learned cartography in teaching school?" he asked. "I learned it from my father. He assisted with supply logistics for the Philadelphia recruitment office during the war." She tapped the map. "This is your blind spot, the North Ridge. Anyone moving from the Voss Ranch in that direction can use the ridge for cover all the way to the tree line behind your barn." That's how the Cutter brothers approached us yesterday without Jonas seeing them until it was too late. Jonas leaned over her shoulder to look. "She's right. I was watching the South Trail." "We need eyes on that ridge," Eleanor said. Rourke shook his head slowly. "I've only got 2 men. Can't watch the whole property." "You have 3 people," Eleanor said. She looked at him steadily. "Teach me to shoot." The silence that followed had a particular quality, the quality of 2 men simultaneously reassessing the woman standing in front of them. "You ever fired a weapon?" Rourke said at last. "No." "Ever held one?" "No." Jonas made a sound that was possibly a cough. "Then teach me," Eleanor said, "unless you'd rather I throw arithmetic textbooks at the Cutter brothers." The first lesson happened that same afternoon. Rourke set tin cans on the top rail of the corral fence and handed Eleanor a Winchester repeater. It was heavier than she'd expected, heavier than anything that looked that compact should be, and when she raised it to her shoulder, it felt foreign, alien, and completely necessary. "Feet apart," Rourke said, standing behind her. "Left foot forward. Lean into it. The recoil will knock you flat if you don't." She pulled the trigger. The shot went 10 feet wide. The recoil drove the stock into her shoulder hard enough to leave a bruise that would darken from red to purple by morning. "Again," she said. She fired 30 rounds that first afternoon, hit 1 can. Her shoulder swelled and her ears rang for hours. She didn't say a word about either. She came back the next morning and fired 30 more. 3 cans. By the 3rd day, she was hitting 4 out of every 5. "She's a natural," Jonas told Rourke that evening. "She's stubborn," Rourke said. "Same thing out here." A week passed then, too. The letter would have reached Cheyenne by now. Eleanor found herself watching the South Trail every morning with a vigilance that had become so habitual, she did it without thinking, waiting for something, a ride or a response trouble. The waiting had its own particular cruelty, worse in some ways than the thing itself. Then on a Thursday morning hot enough to crack stone, a rider appeared on the South Trail. Rourke saw him first. He set down the hammer he'd been using to repair the barn door hinge and reached for his rifle in one smooth motion, without hurry, as if the reaching and the seeing were one continuous gesture. Jonas materialized from behind the house. Eleanor stepped onto the cabin porch with her hand on the Colt revolver she'd been wearing in Rourke's old gun belt for 6 days now, the weight of it no longer foreign to her hip. The rider was alone. That was the first wrong thing. Voss never went anywhere alone. As he drew closer, Eleanor recognized the horse before the man, a black gelding with a white blaze on his forehead. The sheriff's horse. "Sheriff Lyle," Rourke said. His voice had gone completely flat. The man rode into the yard and pulled up his horse with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to arriving at places where he wasn't entirely welcome. He was thin with a drooping mustache and careful eyes, the eyes of a man who spent his life calculating which direction the wind was blowing before he committed to any action. "Rourke," he said. Then with exaggerated formality, "Miss Marsh." Eleanor said nothing. "What do you want, Lyle?" Rourke asked. The sheriff reached into his coat. "Got a court order from Judge Merritt," He produced a folded document. Voss has filed a complaint alleging the auction transaction was conducted under fraudulent terms, and he's requesting the sale be voided and, oh, he glanced at Eleanor. The property be returned to appropriate custody. Property. Eleanor's voice was so quiet it was almost conversational. He's calling me property in a legal document. Lyle had the grace to look momentarily uncomfortable. Ma'am, I'm just delivering. You're delivering a piece of paper that describes me as a thing to be returned. She came off the porch step by step, each one deliberate. Like a horse, like a crate of dry goods. The judge signed it. Judge Merritt plays cards with Voss every Saturday evening, Rourke said. Everybody in this valley knows that. I don't know anything about. You stood on the boardwalk, Eleanor said, stopping 3 feet from the sheriff's horse, and watched them sell me. I saw your badge. I saw the sun on it. You were standing right there with your arms folded, and you watched it happen. The sheriff pulled at his collar. The horse shifted under him, sensing something. The auction was presented to me as a legitimate what? Sheriff Lyle. Eleanor's voice dropped to something below quiet, something that made the man lean back in his saddle despite himself. Finish that sentence. I want to hear you say it. He didn't finish it. I wrote a letter, Eleanor continued, to the Cheyenne leader in the Laramie Sentinel. I named Voss, I named the auctioneer, and I named you with your full name and your title and a description of exactly where you were standing and exactly what you watched happen. She paused. So when you ride back to Copper Bend, you tell Harlan Voss that his court order doesn't frighten me, and you tell him one more thing. The sheriff waited. Tell him the school teacher is still here, and she's not finished writing. Lyle stared at her for a long moment. His horse danced beneath him. Then he said, 14 days, and turned the gelding and rode out. They watched him go until the dust closed over the trail behind him. Caleb, Eleanor turned. Rourke was watching her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, that particular look of a man recalculating something he thought he'd already figured out. You named the sheriff, he said. I named everyone who participated, everyone who watched, everyone who profited. She looked back at the trail. That's half the town. Then half the town has reason to be afraid of you. Good. He ran his hand over his jaw. You just made this about more than you and me and Voss. You made it about the whole territory. It was always about the whole territory. She met his eyes. It was never just about us. Rourke looked at her for a long, still moment. Something shifted in his expression, something deeper than the recalculation she'd been seeing, something that looked almost like awe, and that awe made her oddly uncomfortable. Jonas, he said without turning, ride to the Holt place, tell Agnes what happened, then ride to the Dre Ranch, to Pratt, to Vera Sutton, every rancher in this valley who's had trouble with Voss. Tell them there's a hearing in 14 days and they might want to be there. Jonas was on his horse and moving before Rourke finished the sentence. Rourke turned back to Eleanor. If we're doing this, we do it right. You said you came west to teach. Yes. Then teach. Open the line shack. Start your school. Make it real before that hearing. Because when we stand in front of Judge Merritt, I don't want Voss pointing at a woman he bought. I want him pointing at a school teacher who serves this community. He paused. Makes him look considerably worse. Eleanor's breath caught. Not because of the strategy, though it was smarter than she would have expected, but because of what he'd just done. He'd taken the thing she'd ached for since the day she left Philadelphia, the thing that was hers alone and separate from everything that had happened to her, and he'd understood it well enough to see its power. He hadn't diminished it. He'd recognized it. I'll need help cleaning the shack, she said. You'll have it. And the books from the wagon. Already thought of that. They stood in the yard in the afternoon heat, 2 feet apart, the sheriff's dust still settling in the air. Eleanor felt something pulling between them, a gravity, a current that had nothing to do with obligation or circumstances. Something older than any of that. She stepped back. I should work on lesson plans, she said. I should check the south fence. He turned. Yeah. They went in opposite directions. Both of them, Eleanor noticed, walking slightly too fast. The next 11 days moved like a fever dream. Eleanor threw herself into the line shack with the same ferocity she'd brought to the ledger books. Rourke and Jonas cleared it out and repaired the roof, built rough benches from scrap lumber. And Eleanor scrubbed the floor on her hands and knees, hung a slate board that Rourke fashioned from a piece of flat stone, and arranged her books on a shelf that Jonas nailed to the wall with the quiet precision of a man who took small things seriously. Word spread the way word spreads in open country through Agnes Holt, who told the ranch families, through Jonas, who told the families along the North Creek, through Eleanor herself, who wrote invitations on scraps of paper and gave them to anyone willing to carry them. The first morning of school, 7 children arrived, 3 from neighboring ranches, 2 from a mining family whose father worked a claim on the Eastern Ridge, and 2 children whose mother had walked them 3 miles through the summer heat and then stood in the doorway for a long moment before nodding and going back the way she'd come. Eleanor stood in front of them with her McGuffey's reader and her battered arithmetic textbook and her rope-scarred wrists and taught them the alphabet. She taught them the way she always had, as if it were the most important thing happening in the world at that moment, because it was. By the end of the first week, she had 12 students. By the second week, 15. Parents started appearing, mothers who sat in the back with their hands folded, listening to their children read aloud. A rancher named Cole Dre, who admitted without embarrassment that he'd been signing contracts for 20 years without being entirely sure what they said. "You're building something," Rourke told her one evening. He was leaning in the doorway of the main house, watching her prepare lessons at the kitchen table. She'd moved her work there gradually without either of them acknowledging it. "I'm doing what I came here to do," she said without looking up. "Eleanor?" Something in his voice made her stop writing. "The hearing's in 3 days," he said. "Voss has been quiet." "I know. That worries me more than if he'd burned the whole property." Eleanor set her pen down. "A man like Voss doesn't go quiet unless he's assembling something larger. And I keep thinking," he stopped. "Say it. I keep thinking he might not wait for the hearing. I think he might come for you before we ever get to that courtroom." The possibility had lived in Eleanor's mind for days, crouched quietly in the corner, where she put things she couldn't do anything about until she could do something about them. She'd been waiting for Rourke to say it out loud. "Then we don't give him the chance," she said. "We go to Copper Bend early. Tomorrow. Stay at Agnes's until the hearing. Jonas watches the ranch. If we're in town with witnesses around us, Voss won't move in plain sight." Rourke's jaw worked. "In town with the whole valley watching, he won't dare." "He won't dare," Eleanor agreed. A pause. "All right," Rourke said. "Tomorrow." They left at first light, Rourke and Eleanor in the wagon, Jonas on horseback, with instructions to shoot anyone who came through the gate without an invitation. The cattle buyer Hargrove had already come and gone. Eleanor had negotiated $29 a head instead of $28, and the extra $10 felt like a flag planted in Voss's soil. 4 hours of dust and heat in a silence that had its own particular texture, the texture of 2 people thinking about the same thing from different angles and choosing not to say it yet. Halfway to Copper Bend, Eleanor said, "Whatever happens at the hearing, I need you to know something." Rourke waited. "I would have found a way out eventually, even without you. I want you to believe that." He looked at her. The road stretched ahead of them, bone white in the July sun. "I do believe that," he said. She nodded. Then after a moment, "I'm glad it was you, at the back of that crowd." Rourke's hand moved on the reins, not toward her, just the smallest shift. "I'm glad too," he said, rough, quiet, like the words cost something and he'd paid the cost without hesitating. Copper Bend looked smaller to Eleanor than it had 3 weeks ago. Meaner. The same dusty square, the same storefronts, the same auction platform still standing in the sun, as if nothing had happened there. But something had changed in the way she moved through it, or perhaps the thing that had changed was her. She walked the same streets, but she walked them differently now. She was not a woman arriving. She was a woman returning. Agnes met them at the trading post with fresh cornbread and bad news. "Voss brought in a lawyer," she said, pulling them into the back room and shutting the door. "Real one from Denver. Arrived on yesterday's stage." "Denver lawyer," Rourke said. "His name is Theron Fisk. He's been in conference with Judge Merritt since this morning. 3 hours, Caleb." Agnes's face was tight. Ned watched the whole thing from the window. "Fisk is expensive," Eleanor said. "The most expensive kind." Agnes looked at her. "The kind that uses words the way other men use bullets." "Then he'll be disappointed," Eleanor said, "because I know a few words myself." That evening people came. Not many at first, then more. The Dre family from the South Ranch. Old Owen Pratt, who'd lost his grazing rights to Voss 5 years before moving slow on a cane, but with eyes sharp as a hawk's. Vera Sutton, whose husband Jack had refused to sell his claim and died in a barn fire. The sheriff had called Accidental, who sat in Agnes's back room with her hands folded in her lap and her spine perfectly straight. They came one by one, and one by one they told their stories. Quietly, in the particular low register of people who'd learned that speaking too loudly about certain things brought consequences. Eleanor wrote everything down, every name, every date, every specific detail she could draw out of them. "What are you going to do with all of that?" Owen Pratt asked, watching her fill page after page. "I'm going to read it in that courtroom," she said. "Every word." The room went very still. "He'll destroy you," Vera Sutton said softly. "He destroys everyone who speaks up." "He's already destroying us," Eleanor replied. She looked around the room at these weathered, frightened, stubborn faces. "The only question is whether we let him do it in the dark or whether we make him do it in the light." Rourke was in the doorway at the back of the room. He hadn't spoken during the entire meeting. He hadn't needed to. Eleanor could feel his presence the way you feel a solid wall behind you when you're standing against strong wind. You don't have to touch it to know it's there. This was Eleanor's fight. He was smart enough to know that, brave enough to step back and let it be. The night before the hearing, Eleanor sat in Agnes's spare room with her notes spread around her and her hands shaking not from fear, but from the weight of what she was carrying. All those stories, all that trust placed in her hands. A knock at the door. Soft. "Come in." Rourke, he stood in the doorway with his hat in both hands, turning it the way he did when something sat uneasy in him. "Couldn't sleep either," she said. "Couldn't sleep." He came inside and took the chair across from her. The lamplight moved across both their faces. "I need to say something before tomorrow." Eleanor waited. "That day at the auction," he said, "I told you I did it because of Adeline, because of what Voss took from me." He turned the hat in his hands. "That was true. It wasn't on all of it." "What was the rest?" He looked up, those gray-green eyes holding everything he hadn't said. "You were up there with rope on your wrists and blood on your mouth and 100 men staring at you." His voice was careful, deliberate. "And you weren't crying. Your chin was up. Your eyes were burning. You looked—" He stopped, started again. "You looked like you wanted to tear that entire platform apart with your bare hands. Every board of it." Eleanor's throat tightened. "And I thought," his voice cracked slightly, and he pressed through it, "that woman is going to change the world if somebody just gives her a chance." He paused. "I couldn't let that chance end in Harlan Voss's hands." The tears burned Eleanor's eyes. She blinked them back. "Caleb." She stood, crossed the small room, took his hat out of his hands and set it on the table. Then she took his face between her palms, her scarred, ink-stained, rope-marked hands, and kissed him. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't careful. It was 3 weeks of captivity and 2 weeks of freedom, and everything in between compressed into a single point of contact. His hands came to her waist, then her back, pulling her in with a hunger that answered hers exactly. When they broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Rourke pressed his forehead against hers. "Eleanor, don't say we shouldn't have done that." "I wasn't going to." "Good." She stepped back. "Tomorrow I'm going to stand in front of that judge and fight for every person in that room. I need to know that when I look across that courtroom, you'll be there." "I'll be there," he said, "no matter what." She picked up his hat from the table and held it out. "Get some sleep, Caleb." He took the hat, stood. In the doorway, he turned back. "Eleanor." "Yes." "You're going to be magnificent tomorrow." "I know," she said. "Now go." He left. She stood in the room with her heart hammering and her notes spread around her like a battlefield. She gathered them, read through them one more time, and laid down with her eyes open and the word ready turning in her chest like a key finding the right lock at last. Eleanor woke to sun already hot on her face and the sound of the town stirring beyond Agnes's window. She sat up, reached for her notes, and read them through once more without rushing. Every name in order, every date, every crime she could document, and every she could corroborate. She dressed in the clothes Agnes had given her, a cream blouse freshly pressed, and a dark skirt she'd mended at the hem the night before by lamplight. She wrapped her wrists in clean cloth, pinned her hair back, and stood before Agnes's small mirror for a moment that had nothing to do with vanity. She looked at the woman looking back at her, thinner than she'd been in Philadelphia, harder around the eyes, but standing straight. "You look like you're going to war," Agnes said from the doorway. "I am." Agnes handed her coffee and a biscuit. "Eat. You can't fight on an empty stomach no matter how many words you've got." Eleanor ate. The coffee was bitter and strong and exactly right. When she came downstairs, Rourke was waiting outside. He'd shaved. That was the first thing Eleanor noticed, and it nearly undid her composure. This man, who slept on the ground and built fence posts by hand and had just spent his entire life savings on a stranger's freedom, standing in the morning light in a clean shirt with his face shaved clean, because it mattered. Because this day mattered. Because she mattered. She walked past him without speaking. She didn't trust what would come out if she tried. "Ready?" he asked. "Yes." She kept walking. "Let's go." They walked together toward the town hall. Agnes fell in behind them. Then Ned, then the Dre family who'd arrived at first light from the South Ranch coal dray in his best boots. Owen Pratt on his cane, Vera Sutton in widow's black spine straight. Families Eleanor didn't recognize ranchers from farther out, a mining family from the Eastern Ridge, two women with infants on their hips who had simply shown up because word had reached them and they'd come. By the time they reached the town hall steps, 30 people were walking behind Eleanor and Rourke. 30 people who were tired of being afraid. Eleanor didn't look back. If she saw those faces, she'd cry. She was done crying in this town. Inside the hall had been arranged with rows of chairs facing a heavy oak table at the front. Every chair was filled. People stood along the walls, more pressed against the windows outside, faces visible in the gaps between the building's boards. Voss was already seated at the petitioner's table. He wore a charcoal suit, silver watch chain glinting at his vest pocket, the picture of respectability from a sufficient distance. Behind him sat Theron Fisk, lean, sharp-featured spectacles that caught the light and gave his eyes an unreadable quality. Fisk was sorting his papers with the efficiency of a man who charged by the quarter hour and earned every cent. Voss looked up when Eleanor entered. He smiled, the same smile she remembered from the boarding house window, smooth patience, certain of itself. Eleanor smiled back. It was not a warm smile. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a woman who had spent 3 weeks in a PH and remembered every single detail of it. Voss's smile faltered. Just for a moment. Judge Aldous Merritt arrived through a side door, settled his considerable weight behind the oak table, and banged his gavel with the authority of a man who expected to be done before noon. "This hearing is called to order. The matter before the court is the petition filed by Mr. Harlan Voss to void the sale transaction of July 7th, 1878, and determine the legal disposition of one Eleanor Adeline Marsh." Legal disposition, like she was a piece of furniture someone had left on the street. "Mr. Fisk, you may proceed." Theron Fisk rose with the ease of a man who'd done this in front of judges far more important than Aldous Merritt. He buttoned his jacket, adjusted his spectacles, and turned to face the room with the particular confidence that comes from knowing you are in most circumstances the smartest person in it. "Your Honors, the facts of this matter are simple. On July 7th, a private auction was conducted in the town square of Copper Bend. This auction had no territorial authorization, no legal charter, and no lawful standing. The transaction between Mr. Dawson, Mr. Rourke, and the defendant was therefore void from inception." He paused, letting that settle. "We ask the court only to recognize what territorial law already provides that an illegal transaction carries no legal weight. Furthermore, as Miss Marsh has no family, no legal guardian, and no established domicile in this territory, we respectfully request the court appoint an appropriate guardian to oversee her welfare until proper arrangements can be determined." He returned to his seat with the satisfaction of a man who'd just played an ace. It was, Eleanor had to admit, elegantly constructed. By calling the auction illegal, Fisk had accomplished two things at once. He had voided Rourke's claim on her and opened the door for Voss to step in as court-appointed guardian. Clean, legal, almost admirable in its cruelty. "Mr. Rourke," Judge Merritt said, already looking bored. "Your response." Caleb Rourke stood. He didn't have a lawyer. He didn't have papers or spectacles or a three-piece suit. He had calloused hands and a clean shirt and the look of a man who'd rather be fixing fence but wasn't going to leave. "Your Honor, I'm not a lawyer and I won't pretend otherwise. but I'd like to ask that Miss Marsh be permitted to speak for herself. Merritt frowned. This is a legal proceeding, Mr. Rourke, not a public assembly. So was the auction, Rourke said. Seems we're past regular. A murmur moved through the packed room. Merritt's frown deepened, but he looked at the faces pressed against the windows and made a calculation. Very well. Miss Marsh, you may address the court. Briefly. Eleanor stood. The room went quiet the way rooms go quiet when something is about to matter. Your Honor, she said. Her voice was the voice she used in the schoolroom, clear measured designed to reach the back row without strain. Mr. Fisk is correct. The auction was illegal. She paused, watched Fisk look up from his notes. I agree with him completely. Absolute silence. Even Voss had gone still. The auction was illegal because selling human beings is illegal. It was illegal when it happened to me, and it has been illegal every other time it has happened in this territory to women who had no one to speak for them. She stepped forward. But Mr. Fisk's argument has a logical problem. If the auction carried no legal standing, if no lawful transaction occurred, then I was never anyone's property. Not Mr. Rourke's, and certainly not Mr. Voss's. She turned to face the room directly. I am 31 years old. I am educated. I am employed. I operate a school on Mr. Rourke's property that currently serves 17 children from this valley. I am not a ward. I am a citizen of the United States of America, and this court has no authority to assign me a guardian as though I were a child or a horse. Your Honor, Fisk was on his feet. Miss Marsh has no standing to, I have standing because I am the person you're arguing about. Eleanor turned to look at Fisk directly. You called me a ward of the territory, a ward. I would like you to say that again slowly in front of these people so they understand exactly what is being proposed here. Fisk sat. Merritt's gavel twitched but didn't fall. Mr. Voss claims he wants to protect my welfare, Eleanor continued. She unfolded the first page of her notes. I would like to tell this court about his interest in my welfare. She read the date, the arrival, the locked room, the stolen documents, the bruise on her arm which she displayed by rolling back her sleeve so the whole room could see it yellow-green now, but still carrying the clear imprint of individual fingers. Fisk objected. Eleanor acknowledged the objection and continued. She spoke about the attempts to escape. The second time, the ropes on the platform. She spoke about Harlan Voss's water rights arrangement with Caleb Rourke, about Adeline Rourke who died waiting for a doctor who never came, about the papers delivered to Rourke on the day of his wife's burial. Then she turned to the room. Owen Pratt, will you stand? Old Owen Pratt pushed himself up on his cane. His voice was thin but clear. Harlan Voss diverted my irrigation channel in '73. When I complained he had men tear down 3 miles of fence and scatter my cattle, I lost everything I'd built. Thank you, Vera Sutton. Vera stood. Her hands trembled, but her chin did not. My husband Jack refused to sell our claim to Voss. 2 weeks later, our barn caught fire at night. Jack went in to save the horses. Her voice broke. He didn't come out. The sheriff ruled it an accident. Cole Dre, a farmer named Jessup, a shopkeeper who'd paid what amounted to tribute to avoid having his windows broken. A mother whose son had been beaten by Voss's men for cutting a path across what Voss had decided was his land. 11 people, 11 stories, 11 crimes that had never been reported because the sheriff worked for Voss and the judge played cards with him. Until today. Eleanor watched Judge Merritt's face as each person spoke. The man had gone from florid to gray. Sweat beaded on his forehead. He wasn't just uncomfortable. He was terrified because every word spoken in this room was being heard by 100 witnesses, and a letter describing all of it was already in the hands of 2 territorial newspapers. Your Honor, Fisk's voice had lost its polished edge. These testimonials are irrelevant to the specific legal. They demonstrate a pattern, Eleanor said. Mr. Voss does not want guardianship of me because he cares about my welfare. He wants control of me because I am the first person in this valley who put his crimes on paper and signed her name to them. She faced Merritt directly. That is what this hearing is about. Not property law, not guardianship, control. And this court should be very careful about what it agrees to facilitate. The room was silent. Then Harlan Voss stood up. He buttoned his jacket with deliberate care, smoothed his silver hair, looked at Eleanor across the room with an expression that was perfectly controlled, calm, almost amused. But his eyes were not amused. Eleanor recognized what was in his eyes. She'd seen it through the boarding house window, through the locked door, in the moment before things stopped being polite. "Your Honor," Voss said in the smooth, caring voice of a man who'd never once doubted that the room would stop for him. "I've listened patiently to Miss Marsh's accusations. I've listened to a parade of grievances from people with long memories and short evidence. And I've listened to Mr. Rourke hide behind a woman's courage instead of facing me as a man." Rourke stiffened. Eleanor put her hand on his arm. "Don't. The facts remain simple." Voss looked at the judge. "The auction had no legal standing. The transaction is void. Miss Marsh is a stranger in our territory with no property, no family, and a remarkable talent for stirring trouble. The court has a duty to provide her appropriate. The court has a duty to hear the truth." A new voice. From the back of the room, every head turned. A man stood in the open doorway, tall, gray-haired, wearing a long coat despite the July heat and a badge that caught the light in a way that was unmistakable. Not a sheriff's star. Something federal. The man walked forward. The crowd shifted to let him pass without being asked. He reached the front table and placed a folded document in front of Judge Merritt. "United States Marshal Cade Holloway," so he said, "I'm here on the authority of the territorial governor." He looked at Merritt. "Governor Thier received a letter 4 days ago from a Miss Eleanor Marsh detailing allegations of unlawful detention, human trafficking, and the corruption of territorial officials in and around Copper Bend." He turned to look at Voss. "Your name appeared with considerable frequency, Mr. Voss." The blood left Harlan Voss's face. Not slowly, all at once, like a lamp going out. "This is," Voss started. "This woman filed a formal complaint with the territorial governor's office. The governor takes human trafficking very seriously, particularly when it occurs in his territory, particularly when local law enforcement appears to have watched it happen." Marshal Holloway's gaze moved briefly to Sheriff Lyle, who had gone the color of old chalk. "I am instructing this court to dismiss Mr. Voss's petition. I am also informing the court that the governor's office will be conducting a full investigation into the events described in Miss Marsh's letter, including the conduct of local officials." He produced a second document. "And I have a warrant to inspect Mr. Voss's property and records for evidence relating to the unlawful detention and auction of Miss Marsh, and to determine whether other persons may have been similarly victimized." "On what grounds?" Voss's voice had gone thin and high. "On the grounds that a citizen of the United States was kidnapped, held against her will, and sold at public auction in your town." Holloway's voice went quiet and very hard, and nobody lifted a finger to stop it, except one man who spent everything he had. His eyes found Rourke. Rourke looked at Eleanor. Eleanor's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her notes and breathed. Voss turned to Fisk. "Do something." Fisk looked at the federal marshal, looked at the warrant, looked at his client. "Mr. Voss," he said with the careful precision of a man who charged too much per hour to waste a single word, "I strongly advise you to stop speaking. You're not paying me to— Oh, I'm paying you to protect my legal interests." Voss's voice cracked. "And right now, your legal interests are best served by complete silence." Fisk's voice was ice. "Trust me." Voss's mouth opened, closed. His hands, those manicured, powerful hands that had signed away water rights and ordered barn fires and poured whiskey, while a woman died waiting for a doctor who never came, were shaking. "Good," Eleanor thought. "Now you know what it feels like." Judge Merritt cleared his throat. His gavel hand trembled. In light of the federal authorities' intervention, he swallowed. "This court dismisses the petition filed by Mr. Voss. Miss Eleanor Marsh is recognized as a free citizen with full legal standing in this territory. This hearing is adjourned." The gavel came down. The room exploded. People were on their feet, voices rising together. Agnes Holt grabbed Eleanor from one side and squeezed until Eleanor's ribs protested. Owen Pratt was pounding his cane against the floor in a rhythm that had taken on the character of a drum beat. Vera Sutton had both hands over her mouth, tears streaming, shoulders shaking. Through the noise and movement and the stinging behind her own eyes, Eleanor found Rourke. He was standing exactly where he'd stood throughout, still watching her, his gray-green eyes holding everything the last weeks had built between them. She pushed through the crowd, reached him. "You're shaking," he said. "I know. You were magnificent. I know that too." He laughed. The first real laugh she'd ever heard from him, deep, rough, broken open by something that had been locked up for a very long time. He pulled her against him, right there in the middle of the crowd, and Eleanor pressed her face against his chest and felt his heart hammering and heard it slow. "Eleanor Marsh," he said into her hair, "you just took down the most powerful man in this valley with a stack of paper and a teacher's voice." "We took him down," she said. "All of us." "No," he pulled back, held her at arm's length, his eyes fierce and certain. They followed you. Don't take that from yourself." Outside, she could hear Voss being escorted from the building by Marshal Holloway and two deputies who'd materialized from somewhere. His voice was audible through the walls, sharp, indignant, diminishing. Then silence where his voice had been. That evening, Eleanor sat on the bench outside Agnes's trading post in the cooling air, the heat of the day finally breaking. Rourke settled beside her. Close, their shoulders touching. "That money," Eleanor said. "The $3,000. Eleanor, I'm going to pay you back. Not out of obligation, because it's right. The school, I'll charge tuition, whatever families can spare, and every penny above cost goes to you. I'll keep the ledgers myself so you can see exactly where every dollar comes from." He shook his head. "You're going to let me do this," she said. His mouth moved. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever encountered in my life." "You've mentioned that." "Didn't say I minded." She leaned her shoulder against his, just slightly, enough to feel the warmth of him through the linen of his clean shirt. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," he said, "we go home." Home. The word settled into Eleanor's chest the way a key settles into the lock it was cut for, with a small, precise click of rightness. "Yes," she said. "Let's go home." Across Copper Bend, in the largest house on the main street, a lamp burned. Harlan Voss sat at his desk. The court order lay in pieces on the floor where he'd put his fist through it. His whiskey glass stood full and untouched. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out the map. The ranch marked in red, the circle he'd drawn around it. He picked up his pen, drew a second circle, much larger, encompassing the whole valley. Then he rang his bell. "Change of plans," he said when the big man appeared. "I don't want just the ranch anymore." "What do you want?" Voss set the pen down. Outside, Copper Bend slept. "Everything," he said, "and I want it before that marshal rides back to Cheyenne." They made it 3 days before Voss moved. Eleanor was in the Line Shack schoolhouse when she heard the horses. Not one or two, many coming hard from the North Ridge. Her map had put that ridge in red ink for exactly this reason. She grabbed the Winchester from behind the door and turned to the classroom. 12 faces looked back at her. The youngest was 6, clutching a McGuffey primer. The oldest was Abigail Dre, 14, who had been teaching the younger ones their letters on the mornings Eleanor ran long on arithmetic. "Everyone out the back door," Eleanor said. "Right now, run to the main house and find Jonas. Go." Abigail stood immediately, took the smallest child's hand, and moved. She didn't ask questions. Eleanor had made sure of that in the second week she taught them this, the same way she taught everything else practically without softening it. If you hear horses coming fast and I tell you to run, you run. No questions, no hesitation. You move. The children were through the back door before Eleanor reached the front. She stepped onto the porch with the Winchester against her shoulder and counted. 7 riders coming down from the ridge at a controlled pace, fast enough to announce intent, slow enough to enjoy it. The man in front was lean and sharp-faced, riding as if the horse were part of his body. Rand Cutter. Agnes had described him well. Behind him, Lyle, thick and mean-eyed, scanning the yard with the professional attention of a man cataloging what he planned to destroy. Dutch, enormous and expressionless. And 4 others she didn't recognize, hired men, the kind you rented by the day for ugly work. 7 men, 1 woman, 1 rifle, 30 rounds. Eleanor fired into the dirt 10 feet in front of Rand Cutter's horse. The animal reared. Rand swore and hauled it back under control. When he looked up, Eleanor was already chambering the next round. "That," she said at a carrying volume, "is close enough." Rand steadied his horse and looked at her with something that might have been professional appreciation. "School teachers got teeth." "Voss didn't mention that." "Voss doesn't know everything about me. Turn around." Can't do that, ma'am. Rand crossed his hands over his saddle horn, easy and patient. Got a job to finish. Mr. Voss wants this property cleared. Buildings, fences, every book in that schoolhouse of yours. He's got legal claim on the water rights, and he intends to enforce them today. Those water rights were extorted from a grieving man at a moment of loss. You know that. What I know is there's a piece of paper says otherwise. Rand glanced past her at the schoolhouse. Nice little building. Be a shame if something happened to it. Eleanor's finger rested against the trigger guard. Touch this school and I'll put a hole in you before your horse clears the yard. One rifle. 7 of us. Rand tilted his head. Math isn't in your favor. Math's never in favor of bullies, Eleanor said. They lose anyway. Rand's easy expression flickered. He hadn't expected that. Men like him were accustomed to fear, to the particular quality of stillness that meant a person was calculating how much they'd have to surrender to make this stop. Eleanor wasn't calculating that. He could see she wasn't, and it confused him. Voss said to give you a choice, Rand said. You and Rourke pack up and leave, quiet. Nobody gets hurt, the valley goes back to. A rifle shot cracked from somewhere behind Eleanor. Not hers. The bullet struck the ground between Rand's horse and Lyle's, sending both animals dancing sideways in a flurry of hooves and dust. Caleb Rourke came from the direction of the barn at a dead-run lever-action rifle in his hands, already working the mechanism for the next round. Get off my land. Rand looked from Eleanor to Rourke and back. Something in his calculation had changed. Well now, he said. 2 of them making a stand. That's, I'll shoot you first, Rourke said. Then your brother. Eleanor takes Dutch. Jonas is on the north ridge with a sharps that'll reach the other 4 before they clear the fence line. You want to test that, you go right ahead. Rand glanced at the north ridge, a long assessing look. Jonas was there. Eleanor couldn't see him from where she stood, but she knew. Jonas was always where he needed to be. Voss isn't going to like this, Rand said finally. Tell him to come say so himself, Rourke replied. Or is he still busy hiding behind hired men? Something ugly crossed Rand Cutter's face. He gathered his reins, made a small sound through his teeth, and the 7 riders turned and walked their horses out. Not fast, making a point we leave when we decide to leave. But they left. Eleanor kept the rifle level until they were past the ridge, and the sound of hooves had faded into the summer heat. Then she lowered her arms. They shook not from weakness, but from the body's honest accounting of what it had just held still through. She locked her elbows and breathed through it. In, out, in. The way she'd breathed on the auction block. The way she'd breathed in the locked room. The way she'd learned to breathe when everything in her wanted to collapse and something deeper refused. Rourke reached her. You all right? I'm fine. Your hands. My hands shake. The rest of me doesn't. She looked toward the main house. Are the children? Jonas had them back to their families before the riders cleared the property. All safe. All safe. Those 2 words. Worth more than anything Voss could send. Eleanor looked at Rourke. He was watching her with that expression she'd come to recognize, the one that meant he'd added something new to an ongoing calculation and was still working out what had changed. 7 armed men, she said, sent to a schoolhouse full of children. He doesn't care anymore about what he hits as long as he hits something. I know. He's not thinking about the investigation. He's thinking about us, about what we've cost him. Scared men with money, Rourke said, are the most dangerous kind. Then we need help, real help, not just us. She turned. Jonas. Jonas appeared at the corral gate, silent as always, rifle across his shoulder. Already thinking it, he said. Every family that stood up at that hearing, and Eleanor said. Every rancher in this valley who testified or watched or simply knew and said nothing. If Voss comes for us, he comes for all of them too. They're witnesses now. He can't let them walk around free indefinitely. Rourke's jaw worked slowly. He was doing the arithmetic, cattle count arithmetic, the practical, unsentimental kind. If we band together, he said, all the families, all the ranches. He said it slowly, testing the shape of it. He can't burn us all out at once, not with a federal warrant hanging over his head. But if he picks us off one by one, he doesn't have to, Eleanor said. So we don't let him. Crow people have been doing exactly this for 100 years, Jonas said. His voice was quiet and certain. When the enemy is larger, you don't fight alone. You become something larger than the enemy. Rourke looked at Jonas for a long moment. Something passed between them, the particular understanding of two men who'd worked side by side long enough to trust each other past the need for words. Ride to the Holt place, Rourke told him. Tell Agnes what happened. Then ride to every ranch in this valley. Tell them Eleanor has a plan. Meeting at the trading post day after tomorrow noon. Jonas was on his horse and moving within the minute. Eleanor set the Winchester against the schoolhouse wall. Her arms ached. Her wrists throbbed where the scar tissue pulled. She stood in the afternoon light outside the school she'd built with her own hands on borrowed land, with secondhand books and borrowed time, and felt something settle inside her that had been in motion since the day she'd stepped off a stagecoach into the wrong life. You called it my plan, she said. It is your plan. It's all of ours. She turned to look at him, about him. The sun was behind him, making the lines of him sharp. Caleb, there's something I need to say. He waited. He'd become good at waiting in the weeks since she'd arrived. He'd always known how to go still, but now his stillness had a different quality, receptive rather than guarded. He was waiting not to avoid something, but to hear it. I love you, Eleanor said. He was quiet for a moment. I don't know when it started, she continued. Maybe at the auction. Maybe when you told me I was losing money on feed costs and you looked genuinely concerned about it. Maybe when you picked up a rifle without being asked. She paused. But it's true, and I'm not going to not say it because of what might happen tomorrow or next week or when the investigation runs its course. Rourke closed the two steps between them. He took her hands, both of them, the scarred ones, the ink-stained ones, and held them in his. I love you, he said. I've been trying to figure out when it started too, and I think it was the moment you told the auctioneer to take his hand off you. He looked at her. Bravest thing I ever heard in my life. She pulled him down by the front of his shirt and kissed him hard once. Then she let go. Now help me save this valley, she said. 22 people showed up at Agnes's trading post 2 days later. They came from every direction, some Eleanor knew by name and some only by sight. The Dre family filled a whole row. Owen Pratt sat in the corner with his cane across his knees and the sharp-eyed stillness of a man who'd been waiting for someone to call this meeting for 5 years. Eleanor stood at the front and didn't use her notes. 2 days ago, Voss sent 7 armed men to my schoolhouse. 12 children were inside. He wanted to burn it to the ground. She looked around the room. This is what he does. He waits for the law to look away, then he takes. He took Owen's water. He took Vera's husband. He took Caleb's wife's chance to live. He took my freedom and tried to sell it. She let the room hold that. He will keep taking until we stop him. Not the marshal in Cheyenne, not the governor. Us, the people who built this valley. A miner named Jennings leaned forward from the back. What you're proposing, some people here have got families. Some of us can't afford. You can't afford not to, Eleanor replied, her voice dropping. You think Voss doesn't know where your family lives? He knows, he's always known. The only thing that's changed is we know it too. She proposed the compact every family committed to defending every other. Shared watch duties, shared information, coordinated response. If Voss moved against one, they all would respond. No one would be isolated. No one would fight alone. Agnes stood first. Frank and I are in. Cole Dre family's in. Owen Pratt struck his cane on the floor. I've been waiting 5 years for someone to say what this woman just said. I'm in till the ground takes me. Vera Sutton, for Jack, I'm in. One by one, 22 families, every one of them. Eleanor looked at Rourke across the room. He was leaning against the back wall, watching her with the full force of those gray-green eyes. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the room and kept going. They worked fast over the following days. Eleanor drew up watch schedules. Rourke coordinated the ranchers. Jonas mapped every approach to every property. Agnes's trading post became the valley's nerve center. Information came in and went out, riders moving between properties, a web of mutual attention that Voss's men couldn't penetrate without being seen. 4 days, 5, a week. Voss went quiet again. Then on a Tuesday morning, Frank Holt rode into the ranch yard at a gallop, barely down from the saddle before he was speaking. Voss is selling, he said. Everything. The ranch, his properties in town, the warehouse, all of it. Moving so fast, it's making people nervous. Selling to who? Rourke asked. A company out of Denver, Pacific Western Land Trust. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her hands. It's him, she said. It's still Voss. He's transferring the assets to a shell company so the investigation can't reach them. Once everything is in the company's name, he claims he doesn't own anything in this valley anymore. The investigation goes after Harlan Voss, the individual. Pacific Western Land Trust is a separate legal entity. Both men stared at her. How do you know about that? Rourke asked. My fiancée in Philadelphia was a banker. She was already moving toward the house. He talked about his work constantly. I hated it at the time. Get me paper and pen, I need to write the fastest letters of my life. She wrote 3. One to Marshall Holloway in Cheyenne, 3 pages precise and specific. Naming the company, detailing the asset transfers she could document, from what the ranchers had reported, naming dates and property values and the legal mechanism being employed. One to the editor of the Cheyenne Leader, whose editor had published her first story and whose second issue now carried it on the front page. And a third, shorter, careful, to the territorial governor's office directly. Sam took all 3 to Cheyenne that same afternoon with instructions to ride through the night. 2 days later, Voss made his final move. Eleanor was in the schoolhouse in the late afternoon, the children gone home cleaning the chalk from the slate board, when she heard a single horse approaching. Not fast, unhurried. The kind of pace that announces intention without announcing urgency. She took the rifle from its place behind the door and stepped onto the porch. Harlan Voss, alone. On his black stallion in his charcoal suit, as if he were going to church. He stopped 20 yards from the schoolhouse and looked at her. Miss Marsh, Mr. Voss, I've come to make you a reasonable offer. He folded his hands over the saddle horn. $5,000, cash. You take the money, leave the territory, and never return. I leave Rourke and his property alone. You have my word. Eleanor let the silence run for a moment. Your word, she said, like the word you gave Caleb Rourke when you promised to send a doctor for his dying wife. Voss's expression didn't change. Adeline Rourke bled to death, waiting for help you promised and never sent. Her child died an hour after her. Eleanor's voice was level. That's not a misunderstanding, Mr. Voss. That's murder. $5,000, he said again, as if she hadn't spoken. It's a generous offer. It is, she agreed, and the answer is no. He studied her for a long moment. The afternoon light was harsh on his face, carving the lines of it deep. I built this valley, he said finally. Something had changed in his voice, not broken but altered, as if he'd been speaking from behind glass and someone had cracked it. Every road, every building. Before me, this was nothing. Empty dirt. I made it into something. You made it into a prison. I made it into a town. He looked at the schoolhouse behind her. A town needs order. It needs someone willing to make hard choices. And that someone is you. It has always been me. Eleanor stepped off the porch and walked toward him until she was close enough to see the veins in his eyes, to see the things she had been watching for since the first time she'd looked at his face across the auction square. She'd thought it was cruelty. She'd thought it was calculation. She'd thought it was the cold, patient wrongness of a man who'd had his own way so long he'd forgotten other people had internal lives. But this close, she saw what was underneath all of it. Fear, real bone-deep fear. The fear of a man who'd spent 30 years controlling everything around him and who had never once considered what it would feel like to lose that control. He didn't know what he was without it. He'd built his entire self on the assumption that he would always win. She almost felt sorry for him, almost. You're going to regret this, he said. Mabby. She held his gaze. But I'll regret it free. He stared at her, and for the last time Eleanor watched something happen in Harlan Voss's face that she had never expected to see there. Not rage, not calculation. The genuine, unguarded bewilderment of a man who had never in all his years of power encountered something he simply could not move. He turned his horse, rode away, didn't look back. Eleanor stood in front of her school and didn't move until the sound of his horse was entirely gone. Rourke was coming from the barn. He'd seen. What did he want? To buy me off, $5,000. And I told him no. She turned. He's out of moves, Caleb. His jaw worked. Sam needs to ride tonight. Sam's already riding. She almost smiled. I sent him before Voss reached the gate. 6 days later, Sam returned from Cheyenne with two things: a letter from Marshall Holloway confirming that the territorial governor that had frozen all asset transfers involving Copper Bend properties pending the investigation, and a copy of the Cheyenne Leader with Eleanor's second story on the front page. Corruption in Copper Bend. School teacher exposes Valley's long shadow. Agnes read it aloud in the trading post to a room packed with families. When she finished, the silence lasted 3 full seconds. Then the room broke into applause, real applause, the kind that fills a space completely. Eleanor sat in the back row and pressed her hand over her mouth and let herself feel it, the full weight of it, for the first time. The investigation took 3 months. Marshall Holloway returned with 2 deputies and a federal prosecutor from the territorial capital. Sheriff Lyle resigned before they could question him formally. Judge Merritt was removed from the bench by the governor's office. The Cutter brothers disappeared into the mountain passes and were never seen in the valley again. On a Wednesday morning in October, they led Harlan Voss out of his house in handcuffs. Eleanor watched from Agnes's porch. He passed within 10 feet of her. His silver hair was disheveled, his charcoal suit rumpled where someone had grabbed his arm to steady him on the steps. He looked at Eleanor as he passed. She looked back. There was nothing left to say. With Voss's assets frozen and his men gone, the valley began to breathe. Families who'd spent years pulling tight around themselves started to expand again, repairing what had been deferred, building what had been postponed, living like people who expected to have a future. Clara's school grew. By September, 23 students. By November, 30. Parents built a proper schoolhouse on the north pasture, real walls, real windows, a wood stove that would keep the children warm through the first blizzards. They painted a sign above the door in letters Eleanor herself had drawn out as a template: Marsh School. She stood in front of it on the first morning and could not speak for a full minute. Rourke came and stood beside her and did not speak either. He understood the weight of it, the way some things are complete in themselves and don't need commentary. He asked her to marry him on a Tuesday evening in December. No ceremony, no preparation. They were at the kitchen table after supper, going over the ranch ledgers together the way they did every night, and he set his pen down and said, "Marry me, Eleanor." She looked up from the accounts. "Is that a question or a command?" "Whichever gets you to say yes." "Yes," she said. He blinked. "That's it," he said. "Did you want a speech?" No, I'm fine." She closed the ledger, stood up, walked around the table, and sat in his lap. He laughed again, that broken open laugh she'd been collecting since the first time she heard it, and held her there in the lamplight of the kitchen that had become hers, without either of them marking the moment it happened. They married in the spring. Not in the schoolhouse, though Agnes had suggested it. Not in Copper Bend's town hall, though it would have held the crowd. They married on the North Ridge, the blind spot she'd marked on her map in red ink, the ridge that had been Voss's angle of approach and was now their altar. A circuit preacher came from Helena. Half the valley came with him. Jonas Birdsong stood as best man. Agnes Holt stood beside Eleanor and cried it openly and denied it with conviction. Bess Garner came from Copper Bend, the first person from town to make the ride after the arrest. She'd shown up at the ranch one morning with a basket of food and tears in her eyes and said simply, "I should have done more." "You did enough," Eleanor told his show. "You put bread through a window when no one else would look at me. That was everything." Bess stood in the front row at the wedding and held a handkerchief she never used. Eleanor wore a dress she'd made herself from fabric Agnes had ordered from Denver. Cream cotton with small blue flowers at the cuffs, blue like the Wyoming sky blue, like the mountains she'd stared at from the auction block when she'd needed something that couldn't be bought or bid upon. When she turned to face Rourke under that open sky, those mountains were behind him, and she felt the rightness of that in a way she couldn't articulate and didn't try. Rourke wept during the vows. Eleanor hadn't anticipated that. This man who'd survived war and loss and 3 years of solitary grief stood in front of everyone he knew and crossed without apology when he said the words. She wiped his face with her thumb. "I thought cowboys didn't cry." "This one does," he said, rough and quiet, "when it counts." Their first child came the following winter, a girl they named Adeline. When Caleb held her for the first time, Eleanor watched something heal in him that she'd thought might be past healing. He sat in the rocking chair Jonas had built and held that baby against his chest and breathed like a man who'd been holding his breath for 4 years and finally let it go. A son followed 2 years later, Thomas for Eleanor's father. He had Rourke's gray-green eyes and Eleanor's stubbornness, and by the time he was 3, he had strong opinions about which cattle had the best dispositions. Reva the dog adored him with a devotion that was frankly embarrassing for a dog of her dignity. The ranch grew. Eleanor's bookkeeping transformed Rourke's operation from a barely surviving patch of dirt into one of the most efficient ranches in the territory. They bought back the water rights Voss had stolen, expanded south, then west. Jonas built his own cabin on the eastern ridge and married a woman named Laughing Bird, who taught traditional beadwork at Eleanor's school with the same patient authority Eleanor brought to arithmetic. The school became the Valley Center. Eleanor taught for 31 years. She taught children who grew up to be ranchers and doctors and lawyers and teachers themselves. She taught mothers who'd never learned to read and fathers who'd been signing contracts for decades without being sure what they said. She taught a generation of Wyoming children that words were the most powerful tools ever put into human hands, and that education was the one thing no one could ever truly take. Her father had been right about that. He'd just been wrong about the nobody part. Someone had tried, and they had failed. On their 10th anniversary, Rourke and Eleanor rode up to the North Ridge at sunset. The valley spread below them in the golden light, the school, the ranch, the creek threading through the fields, 30 families, working land that Voss had once claimed as his alone. Down at the house, Jonas was teaching Adeline and Thomas to track deer in the soft earth behind the barn. Reva supervised from the porch steps, gray-muzzled, now still certain of her authority. "Any regrets?" Rourke asked. Eleanor leaned against his shoulder and looked at the valley below, and thought honestly about his question the way he'd always asked her to think about things honestly without softening the edges. She thought about Philadelphia, Edmund Hale, the broken engagement and the lost position in the stagecoach west and the locked room and the auction block and the rope on her wrists. She thought about a man at the back of a crowd who'd reached into his vest pocket for everything he had. "One," she said. He looked down at her. "I regret that I didn't find you sooner." He pulled her closer, pressed his lips to her temple, held her there in the last light of the day with the mountains watching and the valley breathing below them. "You found me exactly when you were supposed to," he said, "and I'm not letting go." Below them, children's voices rose from the yard, a song Eleanor had taught them about a woman who crossed mountains and rivers and every hard thing in between to find where she belonged. Eleanor closed her eyes and listened. She'd come west to teach. She'd been sold like property. She'd been freed by a man who gave away everything he had for a stranger's dignity. And then she'd done what she had always done, what she would always do. She'd stood up, she'd fought back, and she'd built something that would last. Not because someone had saved her, because she had saved herself. And that made all the difference.